The Stuart Highway stretches endlessly across the Australian outback, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through a barren, red landscape. By day, it's a lonely road, with nothing but the occasional road train or kangaroo to break the monotony. But by night, the highway transforms into something else, a place where the air grows thick with silence and shadows dance just beyond the reach of your headlights. Jake had been driving for hours, his eyes bleary from the endless road. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving him alone with the night. His only company was the low hum of his car's engine and the static of the radio, which had long since lost any signal. He was miles from the nearest town, the nearest human being. Out here, it was just him and the highway. He glanced at the fuel gauge. Nearly empty. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to be this low. He'd have to find a place to stop soon, but there hadn't been a sign of civilization for miles. Just as he was beginning to worry, his headlights caught something in the distance. A sign, rusted and leaning to one side, barely visible in the darkness. Last stop for fuel, 2 miles. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him as he pushed the accelerator a little harder. As he drove closer, he could make out the dim glow of a small gas station, a lone beacon in the sea of night. The station was old, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the windows were caked with dust. But the lights were on, and the pump looked like it still worked. Jake pulled up and got out of the car, the night air cool against his skin. He glanced around, but there was no one in sight. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the creaking of the old sign swaying in the wind. He approached the pump, fumbling with the nozzle. As he did, he thought he heard something, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. He froze, listening. There it was again, a soft, barely audible voice. But when he turned to look, there was no one there. Just the empty road and the vast, dark outback stretching out into infinity. Jake shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination. He was tired, and his mind was playing tricks on him. He resumed pumping the gas, eager to get back on the road. But the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around him, yet from nowhere at the same time. His heart began to race. He glanced around, trying to find the source of the noise. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the empty night behind. But the whispering continued, now almost a chant, surrounding him, closing in on him. Jake didn't wait to see what would happen next. He shoved the nozzle back into the pump, leapt into his car, and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and he sped away from the gas station, his heart pounding in his chest. As the station faded into the distance, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, following him. And though he tried to tell himself it was just the wind, deep down, he knew that the Stuart Highway was not a place to be alone at night. Jake had always heard stories about the Stuart Highway. Growing up, it was the stuff of local legends, whispers of ghostly apparitions, strange disappearances, and eerie encounters that sent shivers down the spine. But he had never put much stock in those tales. They were just that, stories told to scare tourists and keep kids from wandering too far from home. After all, the Outback was a vast and unforgiving place, and it was easy to let your mind play tricks on you when there was nothing but empty desert for miles around. Jake was no stranger to long drives. As a trucker, he had spent most of his life on the road, hauling goods across the country. He had seen his share of desolate highways and lonely stretches of road, but nothing quite like the Stuart Highway. It was different, older, almost like it had a life of its own. It was as if the very road had absorbed the history of the land, the blood, sweat, and tears of those who had traveled it before. This trip was supposed to be just another routine delivery. A straight shot from Darwin to Adelaide, a journey that would take him through some of the most remote and isolated parts of the country. He had done it countless times before, and he knew the route like the back of his hand. But this time, something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of foreboding that he couldn't quite shake. As he drove deeper into the outback, the landscape around him grew more barren, the road more desolate. The towns became fewer and farther between, until they disappeared altogether, leaving nothing but the endless stretch of asphalt and the vast, empty desert on either side. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, and the nights were pitch black, the stars obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. The locals had warned him to be careful. They spoke of the spirits of the Stuart Highway, entities that were said to haunt the road, especially at night. Some claimed they were the ghosts of travelers who had died on the highway, lost souls who couldn't find their way to the other side. Others believed they were something older, more ancient, spirits of the land, angered by the intrusion of modern life into their domain. Jake had laughed it off, but as the miles ticked by, he found himself glancing nervously at the darkening horizon. He wasn't a superstitious man, but there was something about this place that made him uneasy. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no end in sight. The isolation was suffocating, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that whipped across the desert. He had planned to stop in a small town for the night, but as he drove, he realized he had missed the turnoff. It wasn't like him to make mistakes like that, but the sign had come and gone before he even noticed it. Now, there was nothing but the open road ahead of him, and he knew he had no choice but to keep going. The further he went, the more he began to feel like he wasn't alone. It was a sensation that crept up on him slowly, like the gradual dimming of the light. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something out there in the darkness, something that watched and waited. And as the night closed in around him, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits of the Stuart Highway were real, and they were coming for him. Jake's initial unease began to grow into a gnawing dread as the night deepened. The highway, once a mere stretch of asphalt, now seemed to pulse with an eerie life of its own. The moon, a thin crescent in the sky, offered little light, casting long, ominous shadows that danced on the edges of his vision. Every so often, he thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye, a quick flash of motion, a dark figure that seemed to vanish the moment he turned to look. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the feeling that something was wrong was too strong to ignore. The radio, which had been nothing but static for hours, suddenly crackled to life with a burst of white noise. Startled, Jake reached out to adjust the dial, hoping to catch a signal. But all he found was more static, mixed with what sounded like faint, distant voices. His heart skipped a beat as he listened closer. The voices were distorted, garbled, as if they were being spoken through a veil of time. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably mournful, a chorus of lost souls calling out from the darkness. A chill ran down his spine, and he quickly turned the radio off, plunging the cab of the truck back into an oppressive silence. The road ahead stretched endlessly, and Jake's eyes strained to stay focused on the pavement. He knew he needed to find a place to rest, but there was no sign of any towns or rest stops. Just mile after mile of desolate highway. The landscape outside had taken on an otherworldly quality, the shadows deepening and shifting in ways that defied explanation. He felt as though he was driving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. Then, out of nowhere, his headlights caught something up ahead, another vehicle, parked on the side of the road. It was an old, rusted car, the kind you didn't see much of anymore. The hood was up, and the driver's door was open, but there was no sign of anyone around. Jake slowed down as he approached, his instincts screaming at him to keep going, but his curiosity getting the better of him. He pulled over a short distance ahead of the car, leaving his engine running. As he stepped out of his truck, the night air hit him like a wave of cold water, the temperature having dropped sharply in the last hour. He walked towards the abandoned car, calling out into the darkness. "Hello? Anyone there? Do you need help?" There was no answer, only the faint whisper of the wind. Jake hesitated, his eyes scanning the area around the car. The doors were open, the interior covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it had been sitting there for years. But that didn't make sense. Why would someone leave a car like this on a highway, miles from anywhere? Just as he was about to turn back, something caught his eye, a figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing a few yards away. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man, dressed in old, tattered clothes. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching Jake with hollow, empty eyes. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He took a step back, suddenly feeling very exposed and vulnerable. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something that made every instinct in his body scream at him to leave. He turned and hurried back to his truck, not daring to look back. As he slammed the door shut and revved the engine, he cast one last glance in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. With shaking hands, Jake floored the gas pedal, speeding away into the night. But the sense of dread only grew stronger, as if something had latched onto him, following him down the endless stretch of highway. And deep down, Jake knew that he had just encountered the first of many spirits that haunted the Stuart Highway. The further Jake drove, the more the reality of the highway seemed to unravel. The night pressed in on him, thick and suffocating, as if the very darkness was alive and conspiring to swallow him whole. He tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the figure he had seen by the abandoned car. Those hollow eyes haunted him, staring into his soul even when he closed his own. The highway, once a straight and predictable path, began to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. Corners appeared where there should have been none, and the road seemed to loop back on itself, leading Jake in circles. The mile markers were no help either. They seemed to count down and then suddenly jump back, as if mocking his attempts to make sense of the journey. His fuel gauge, which had been nearly full after his stop at the gas station, was inexplicably dropping faster than it should. Panic started to creep in as he realized that, at this rate, he wouldn't make it to the next town. He was trapped, caught in the web of the Stuart Highway, with no escape in sight. As the minutes dragged into hours, the truck's headlights began to flicker, casting sporadic bursts of light on the desolate road ahead. Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white with tension. The shadows on either side of the road seemed to move closer, inching towards him with every flicker of the lights. Shapes began to form within them, figures that slinked and shifted, never fully visible but always present, always watching. Jake's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to keep his eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the things that lurked just beyond the reach of his headlights. But they wouldn't be ignored. The whispers started again, low and insistent, seeping into the cab of the truck like a cold, damp fog. This time, the voices were clearer, more distinct. They called out to him, each one a different tone, a different plea. Some were mournful, others angry, but all of them were filled with an unbearable sadness. Turn back. Stay with us. Help us. Jake shook his head violently, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more demanding. His hands trembled on the wheel, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He felt like he was losing his mind, as if the highway was warping not just the road but reality itself. The ghosts of the Stuart Highway were not just haunting him, they were trying to pull him into their world, a world of eternal night and endless suffering. Desperate, Jake turned the radio back on, hoping for some distraction, some noise to drown out the whispers. But instead of music or static, the radio crackled with the same voices, only now they were screaming, wailing in agony. Jake slammed his fist against the dashboard, shouting into the void, "Leave me alone." His voice echoed back at him, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the Outback. But as his shout faded, the screaming on the radio abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, a void that seemed to stretch out forever. Then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the headlights steadied, the road straightened out, and the voices fell silent. For a moment, Jake dared to hope that it was over, that he had somehow escaped the nightmare. But deep down, he knew better. The Stuart Highway had merely given him a reprieve, a moment to catch his breath before the next wave of terror crashed down on him. And sure enough, just as he began to let out a sigh of relief, the truck's engine sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the thick, impenetrable darkness of the Outback. The ghosts of the Stuart Highway were not done with him yet. The silence after the engine cut out was deafening. Jake sat frozen in the driver's seat, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The darkness outside seemed to press in on the truck, thicker and more oppressive than ever before. He could barely see a few feet beyond the hood, the world outside reduced to a void of blackness. For a moment, he considered trying to restart the engine, but deep down, he knew it was futile. The truck had become just another casualty of the Stuart Highway, another victim claimed by the spirits that haunted the road. With trembling hands, Jake reached for his flashlight, fumbling with the switch before finally managing to turn it on. The weak beam of light did little to dispel the darkness, but it was better than nothing. Taking a deep breath, Jake opened the door and stepped out into the night. The cold air hit him like a slap, chilling him to the bone. He held the flashlight out in front of him, sweeping it back and forth as he slowly walked around the truck. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of gravel under his boots. There was no sign of life, no sound of the wind, nothing to suggest that he was anywhere but in a dead zone, a place forgotten by the world. As he moved further from the truck, the whispering began again, louder and more insistent than before. The voices seemed to come from all directions, surrounding him, echoing in his ears. They were desperate, pleading, filled with a sorrow so deep it made Jake's heart ache. "Help us. Don't leave us. Join us." Jake spun around, trying to locate the source of the voices, but there was nothing, just the impenetrable darkness. Panic gripped him, and he started to back away towards the truck, his heart hammering in his chest. But as he turned, the beam of his flashlight caught something in the distance, an outline, faint but unmistakable. It was a figure, standing at the edge of the light, just beyond where the darkness thickened. As Jake's eyes adjusted, he saw that it was the same man he had seen earlier by the abandoned car, his clothes tattered, his face gaunt and pale. But now there were others with him, shadowy figures that flickered in and out of existence, their features twisted in anguish. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew, without a doubt, that these were the spirits of the Stuart Highway, the lost souls doomed to wander the road for eternity. And now they had found him. The figures began to move closer, their steps slow and deliberate, as if they were being drawn to him. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices all pleading for release, for someone to help them find peace. Jake could feel the weight of their despair, a crushing sorrow that threatened to pull him down into the darkness with them. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not staying here. I won't become one of you." But the spirits didn't stop. They reached out to him, their hands cold and insubstantial, like tendrils of smoke. Jake stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as he tripped over a rock. The light rolled away, casting eerie shadows as it spun, before finally coming to a stop, its beam illuminating the road ahead. In that moment, Jake knew what he had to do. With a surge of adrenaline, he scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't look back, didn't dare to, as he sprinted down the highway, his heart pounding in his chest. The voices screamed after him, but he didn't stop, pushing his legs to carry him faster, further away from the truck, from the spirits, from the nightmare that was trying to claim him. He didn't know how long he ran, but eventually, his strength gave out. He collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The voices had faded into the distance, replaced by the quiet of the night. He was alone again, but the memory of those hollow eyes, those desperate voices, would haunt him forever. Jake had escaped the spirits of the Stuart Highway, but he knew they were still out there, waiting for the next traveler to cross their path. Jake lay on the cold, hard ground, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The relentless darkness of the Outback seemed less threatening now, but it still held an ominous presence, as if the spirits were lingering just beyond his sight, waiting for him to falter. His body ached with exhaustion, and his mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. But he was alive, he had escaped the grasp of the Stuart Highway's ghosts, if only by the skin of his teeth. As he sat up, Jake's thoughts began to settle, and he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The spirits, the voices, the haunting visions, everything he had experienced was unlike anything he had ever known. He had always believed that ghost stories were just that, stories meant to entertain or scare people for a moment before being forgotten. But now, he knew better. The Stuart Highway wasn't just another road, it was a gateway to something darker, something beyond the realm of the living. He looked back at the road stretching out behind him, its surface shimmering under the faint light of the rising moon. It seemed so ordinary now, just a strip of asphalt cutting through the desert. But Jake knew that it wasn't the road itself that was dangerous, it was what lingered around it, the souls trapped in a never-ending journey, seeking release from their torment. With great effort, Jake pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky but determined. He didn't know where he was or how far he had run, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to keep moving. Staying in one place, especially on this cursed highway, was not an option. He couldn't risk another encounter with the spirits, not when he had barely survived the first. Jake started walking, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The night was still thick around him, but he noticed the first signs of dawn creeping over the horizon, a thin line of pale light that promised a new day. He clung to that hope, to the idea that daylight might offer some protection, that the spirits of the Stuart Highway might retreat with the rising sun. As he walked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Even though the whispers had ceased, and the shadowy figures were gone, the memory of their presence clung to him like a second skin. He could still hear their desperate pleas in his mind, feel the cold touch of their hands reaching out for him. The thought of their eternal suffering weighed heavily on his heart, filling him with a sadness he couldn't fully understand. But despite everything, Jake knew he had to survive. He had to make it out of this nightmare and tell others about what he had experienced. Maybe, just maybe, sharing his story would serve as a warning, a way to prevent others from falling into the same trap. The Stuart Highway was a place of ghosts and shadows, a place where the past never truly died. And if people knew the truth, perhaps they would avoid it, leave the spirits in peace, and let the highway reclaim its dead in solitude. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, Jake had reached a small rise that overlooked the endless stretch of road ahead. The light chased away the last remnants of the night, and for the first time in hours, he felt a sense of relief. The spirits had not followed him into the day. Jake continued walking, determined to put as much distance between himself and the haunted stretch of the Stuart Highway as possible. But as he did, he made a silent vow to never forget what he had seen, what he had heard. The spirits of the Stuart Highway would remain with him forever, a reminder that some roads are better left untraveled. Jake's story is one that will stay with him forever, and now it's your turn to share your own experiences. Have you ever encountered something unexplainable? A shadow in the corner of your eye that disappeared when you looked directly at it? Strange noises in the dead of night that made your skin crawl? Or perhaps you've traveled a road that felt too quiet, too eerie, as if it held secrets better left undiscovered? We all have stories that send shivers down our spines, tales of moments that made us question the reality around us. The Stuart Highway might be thousands of miles away, but the spirits and mysteries of the unknown are closer than you think.